Hi, I'm Asia, producer on this session and account executive at Jollywise and The Secret Story Drawer. The Secret Story Drawer is a non-profit initiative that helps underrepresented ethnicities get into the children's media industry. There are so many similar schemes running around and so many changes that are being made when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So we discuss in this session what's changed. We speak to a number of professionals on their opinion and their views on these kinds of matters.
The projects that we've been lucky enough to work on have diversity and inclusion and authenticity kind of built into the storytelling. That's the reason why we liked those ideas. So I think in some ways we haven't been chasing or a diversity and inclusion agenda because naturally we've been lucky that the projects had that kind of baked in already.
As it happens, all of our projects have what is referred to as D&I in them, not because we orchestrate to have those in the programs, but rather because we're interested in programs that have never been done before. And it just so happens that D&I initiatives want producers to highlight these things. So I feel like Big Bad Boo has been doing this long before it was a trend, long before it was a mandate, and it's a part of our DNA as a company.
So MixMups is set to become the first disabled-led by myself, I'm partially deaf and partially sighted, preschool series. So it very, very much benefits from the whole diversity and inclusion shifts that we've seen in the industry. It's taken me 7 years to create and get this show commissioned and into production. And in that time, we've seen huge shifts across the industry and opening up to the value of diverse and inclusive content and meeting those audiences who've been ignored and marginalised for so long.
Well, it's a very important show as this is the first British black animation preschool show in the United Kingdom. And so APROD's, A Production, they were looking for a director of colour. And so our MD, Catherine McQueen, realised the importance of this, especially on a show that centres on a black family, to have a person of colour as a directorial voice. So when I had the interview, we were both honest that we realised that I don't have the experience to actually be the series director, but she realised that I needed training. And so I was supported under the scheme Make a Move by Screen Skills and the BBC. Now we're in season 3, working on season 3. I have been able to become an episodic director.
I've spent the last year and a bit on the BBC Ignite scheme, developing my original idea for a children's TV series. Throughout this development, I've had a lot of support and guidance from our BBC Ignite development exec producer Liz Chan and input from brilliant commissioners like Sarah Muller.
Diversity and inclusion in practice.
Although diversity and inclusion schemes and the agenda is very much in focus over the last 5-10 years, diverse schemes are not new. So 27 years ago, when I was fresh out of art school, I got a traineeship at the BBC and it was part of the Disability Programmes unit which existed then. So here I am 27 years down the line, executive producing a show that has 2 disabled characters and is disabled led. So I think that's a legacy of that scheme at the BBC.
I've always, as a young, artist, a filmmaker, I knew straight ahead after I finished my MA in animation that I actually did not want to be an animator. I mean, respect to every animator out there. I mean, it's not easy, but I knew that that wasn't my strength, but my biggest strength was actually directing. And so to get there, to be honest, if this scheme wasn't put into place, it may have been tricky.
I think the industry has been more willing to have some very tough conversations about what diversity and inclusion actually is. And I think a lot of that is because of pressure from underrepresented people who have just said, look, diversity and inclusion has become a bit of a dirty word because you don't really believe in it, and you're not really, like, you see diversity as a number. You don't see it as a kind of thing to strive towards. So I do think now they are taking a lot more notice. I do think there's a lot of these schemes now are focusing a bit more on like the material benefits to people.
I think Rasta House and Apple Tree House attracted a diverse range of contributors right across the spectrum of production, and ultimately that's a wonderful thing, because that allows you to kind of then work with those new voices and generate new ideas and put a natural momentum into the work you're trying to do as storytellers.
We are much more aware of our cast and crew, our writers, animators, character designers, and everyone who touches our productions to have diversity and inclusion in mind. For example, for our series 16 Hudson, when we wanted to write an episode about Sam, who's of Chinese heritage, in the first season, we went out looking for Chinese Canadian writers. And this was quite difficult to find at that time, about 4 years ago. So what we ended up doing, not just for the Chinese cultural theme, but for many other themes that the show tackles, we decided to train these writers internally and bring them onto the production because no one else was doing it and because these talented creatives were not available to us in the open market. We looked at our production pipeline at the studio, our animators, our storyboard artists, and in post-production, we certainly were not gender balanced and we didn't have people of color and different backgrounds. So we set up another set of workshops to try to mitigate that and to equalize the numbers. And that's an ongoing effort. I would say from 2080, we're now at 40/60, but this is an area where we continue to need to do more work and will always be looking at it to make sure that the numbers are balanced.
Making a change.
The last 5-10 years, we have seen massive shifts. All the content that I saw as a young person didn't really speak to me, and the reason was it was created by people who had absolutely no lived experience of disability. So they told the story through a prism of their own perception of what it was like to be disabled. And it's only really in the last kind of 10 years that we started to see disabled program makers being able to tell their own story, and that's very, very powerful, and it's much, much more authentic.
Over the last decade, I think my approach to the creative process has changed quite substantially, and I think over the last 2 or 3 years it's definitely changed noticeably, and I think that's partly because I've had some wonderful young and diverse voices working with me, and they've brought a new perspective. They've been able to kind of put their hand up and go, Greg, you need to think about that differently. And it's not just been about thinking about the materials differently, but thinking about your process differently, so that the range of voices that you've got around you can be heard within a system that can be sometimes quite noisy. You can do all the diversity and inclusivity work you want, but if you don't change your processes, both your thought processes, but your just practical processes by, say, which you kind of find talent, then you aren't ever really going to be kind of truly diverse.
I don't think I've been in animation long enough to have experienced the struggle that existed before the push to make the industry more representative. I feel like I've come at a really promising time because I'm benefiting from that push. I thought it would be much harder and anticipated more difficulty getting to the position I'm in at the moment. But actually, with every opportunity I've had, there have been people who are championing me. And I think that's as a result of all the hard work that's gone before.
With our series, The Bravest Knight, which is one of the first shows to showcase 2 dads with their young daughter, Nia. It's a knight and a prince in this case who were married. And when we pitched this show at MIPCOM, we were encountered with a lot of, like I said, gasps, but also comments like, "You're so brave to take this on." The kind of resistance that you come across is quite astounding. So we knew this going in, that we would be limited in our distribution. But I think that in order to move the needle and to innovate and to push content forward, someone has to be willing to take those chances. From the beginning, when we pitched Slovak and Friends, we were told that this is a niche product that would not have any audiences outside of the Persian communities. And this past MIPCOM, we did a diversity panel with Disney, where the executive said to me, "We are interested in the most particular of stories because we believe that niche is universal." This idea that niche is universal blew my mind, because I had hoped that when we initially started our company, everyone would see that. And I think over time, they are now seeing that. They're now seeing that particular stories from different parts of the world, or different storylines from different characters and experiences, are in fact universal.
Niche versus universal.
So quite often what we'll see is productions that will be pushing in diverse characters, or pushing in disabled characters as a second thought, as a tick box exercise. What we've done from MixMups is to build a brand and build a show which is relatable to all children, but has disabled children as the characters. But it's not a niche show. So we've worked very hard to deconstruct disabled storytelling and then reconstruct it in a new way, which we feel will speak to all children. So it's not about creating diverse content for diverse people. It's about creating exciting, funny, magical, enchanting content for children, full stop.
Another trap that I find we have fallen into and then dragged ourselves right back out of it are places where we're trying to bring attention to a certain topic, but we're just trying to normalize that topic, really. So as an example, in the first season of 16 Hudson, we were wanting to showcase Luke's family with his two dads. So the writers had suggested that we write an episode about how it's make a card for your dad day at school, and Luke doesn't have enough arts and crafts materials because they only give each child one card and glue and paints to make that card. So we went down this path of writing this episode, and it would highlight the fact that Luke has two dads. And over time, we realized that it was just all wrong, because by highlighting it, we were coming away from the fact that we were wanting to normalize it. However, we did want to introduce Luke's family to our audience, so we completely ditched that initial idea after many meetings, also with our broadcaster, who agreed with us. We came up with the idea of a race in the park on a Saturday, where it's a father-child race, and Lily is in the park without her father because her father had to work on the weekend, as parents do. And so what happens is Luke lends her one of his dads. So this was, to me, the perfect example of how a beautiful family unit can come to the rescue of another family unit because they are blessed with two of one thing. Again, highlighting certainly who Luke's family is, but in a very positive way that put the focus on Lily and the fact that Lily was really sad she couldn't partake in these races. So I think overall we've learned a lot from how to approach the topics, how not to stereotype, and how to normalize these types of episode ideas by being very deliberate and very careful and treating them like you would treat any other topic.
Hiring and retention.
I think hiring's an interesting area. Are we hiring to be able to say we've ticked boxes, to be able to say we've fulfilled a scheme, or are we hiring because we've been lucky enough to go out and meet a wonderful array of people? Have we spent time meeting an array of people that actually means you're looking at the world in an inclusive way? I think if you're just hiring to kind of solve the instant problem, then you, in some ways, you're just potentially just propagating the problem. And I think, and some of this is about long-term things. We've met writers and creators and talent, met them knowing there wasn't necessarily a job around the corner, but maintaining relationships, building relationships over long periods, so that in the future, when you've got a new show, when you've got a new idea, when you've got a new prospect, knowing that you've got a wonderful mix of people from all different backgrounds, knowing that they're there, you've got a school of talent you can call on when the idea's there. That's a good thing, because then you're not kind of fixing a problem now. You've kind of over time built a wonderful kind of collection of creative individuals who can deliver when the project happens or the project gets commissioned.
So A Production has been doing a great job in terms of trying to make the company more diverse. And on Jojo and Gran, obviously, there have been, it's not just me that works on the show, there are other people of colour in the other departments that are on the show. And, you know, some of them have actually been promoted to work on other shows within the company. So it's not just because of this show, you know, people of colour are being hired, but obviously there has the company is actually actively making sure that there are other promotions, and these people that have worked on the show, Jojo Gran, they have been great and they've deserved, you know, these promotions.
In my experience, people are being hired to work only on that thing that they say they're an expert in when it comes to D&I, and sadly not on other things. And this to me is something we can do better on. I find as a diverse creator, as I'm being labeled, which is fine. Again, I'm super happy about the fact that diversity is something that has a light being shown on it. I also believe that as creative and diverse producers, writers, directors, we want to also be able to talk about the shows that we work on, not just on the diversity elements of the shows that we work on. And so this comes to exactly that point, which is that we need to expand and transcend diversity as opposed to just focus on it when we have such talented people that are involved in these shows and we only call on their expertise for that one thing.
Barriers to improvement.
So the barriers for all sorts of groups in getting into the media, so that's class, socioeconomic position, race, gender, disability, sexuality, all of that sits under that umbrella. What we have to realise again is this difference between inclusive attitudes, or so you might think, and structural inclusion. So it's about barriers. So if you're from a low socioeconomic group and you're being asked to take a train to a job interview, that train's 60 quid, you've got to buy a suit, all of those things are placing barriers in your way to achieving that job. You might be absolutely genius at what you do, but you can't actually get into the building that you're being asked to get into. The answer, I feel, is an openness, a flexibility to accommodate different people's different needs, and to recognise at a philosophical level what barriers are. So the pandemic is a fantastic example of this, and how humans have the capacity to rebuild structures when they need to. So I want you to think about this. Most of you who are watching may not be disabled, but when the pandemic came along, we were all disabled. We were the same in ourselves, but we were disabled by this extra thing that was COVID. And so very, very, very quickly, humans found other ways to do things because it suited the majority. And so we started doing Zoom meetings. We started doing online galleries, theatre shows online, because we were all collectively disabled to go out. But that is what disability access is. So now the pandemic's finished, most people are no longer disabled to go out, but there are people like myself who still struggle to access services and things out of the house and access the industry. That is the nature of shifting practices, shifting structures to create structural inclusion. So we all work very hard to include one another in the pandemic. I think we can learn a lot from that in terms of the philosophy of disability and inclusivity, structural inclusivity.
I think we have to look at the socio-economic barriers that determine how the media sector functions and how the media sector works and how it delivers. But those aren't the solutions there aren't necessarily just about looking at the workforce. The solutions there are about the image that the sector projects, particularly onto its younger people. And I think there's a lot of invisible barriers to access, and starting to think about how those invisible barriers kind of get in the minds of 7 or 8 year olds that inform life choices later on. I think that's really, really important.
What can we do as creatives in diverse communities that don't necessarily champion the arts? I love this because in my case, it really applies to the Iranian community. In Iran as a country, copyright laws don't exist. And for that reason, every time as an artist you create something, anyone else can just copy that and you won't be due any royalties or payment, which I think is a fundamental problem with supporting the arts in Iran. And so therefore artists don't earn any money, and so therefore parents tell their children to become doctors or engineers or lawyers because they want a secure future for their children. This is a huge problem and it needs to change. I think what we can do is talk about it every chance we get and encourage our colleagues who are from our community and our colleagues who are not from our community to talk about the importance of funding for the arts, of respecting copyright laws, and of showing role models that are out there doing this work, that are telling our stories, painting the paintings, making the movies, so that we can have a printed record of the various communities. Because in the end, art is a history and a reflection of what we have done. And unless we are able to record that history and have our children and generations to come to reflect on that, all of that history gets forgotten and obliterated, and that is not a good thing for that particular community.
I think a lot of the focus has been a lot about how the industry can do better, but we forget that also where we are from, our home, our parents can also do better. And I think this is why I actually do interviews and why I actually speak in schools, because it needs to be known. Parents need to, work as well, do their part in this for their kids. I come from an African background, and those of you that are Africans know that African parents want either their child to be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant. But when you say art, it's like, what is this art? You know what I mean? And I had 5 siblings, so I was able to, become and go into the art space because a few of my siblings have done the academic stuff. But I still feel that African parents or people from diverse backgrounds need to be educated more about the opportunities in the creative industry and how important it is in society, the creative industry, and not just these academic subjects. When I was in secondary school, I never had someone speak to me in school about being a director. And so for me now, I know how important it is to go into schools and say, hey, I'm a director, I'm a female director in animation, and there are opportunities. And A Production, they have a scheme where they've now been going into schools, and I had that opportunity last year with one of a black animator, and we spoke at assembly and talked about our journey into animation, and a lot of the students there were people of color, and that was bonus. So these things are so important.
Being a role model and being able to share our positive experiences and success stories within our own communities does inspire change and a culture shift. Fortunately for me, my dad was a graphics designer, so when I was considering what career I wanted between a culturally traditional option like law or my hobby, which was drawing, my parents encouraged me to pursue what I was most passionate about. That was a culture shift in my upbringing, which encouraged my development and made me aware of my options. Representation has really mattered to me along my journey. I'm inspired by people like me doing what I aspire to do because they show me that it's possible for me to achieve my dreams. Someone like LaShawn Thomas, who's a Black creator and animator and director working on anime, is a massive example of that. So we have to be as vocal as possible to reach those children at an early age. And also authentic representation. Children seeing themselves on screen and knowing that the person who made that is just like them. A combination of those two things will not only change the narrative, but empower children to pursue their options and their dreams.
For me, D&I, just in the last 4 or 5 years, has come a really long way. The categories have expanded, the incentives have expanded, and this applies mostly to the US and Canada, my point of view. I am not seeing the same types of incentives available across Western Europe. So I think there's a long way to go across Western Europe, and hopefully then these will start to travel east, because we need them in the East just as much as we are developing, creating, and making them happen in the West. So for me, we're at a very early nascent stage of D&I. There's still a long way to go, and we need generational time before we can see true changes happening in the content. So we're at the beginning of it. A lot more needs to happen. New categories will be added as maybe others come off, and the incentives need to move eastward and be expanded. I think the future is very bright, and I'm very excited that we're talking about this stuff, that we're actually putting plans in place to change how content is developed, created, produced, and distributed. But certainly a lot more is needed, and we're on the right track for bringing all types of diverse voices to the forefront and making sure that our children don't have to go through what we went through. So I'm very hopeful.
What a great note to end on from Shabnam. Thank you to all of our contributors for taking part, sharing their views and experiences on diversity and inclusion. We hope this makes you realise and opens your eyes on the industry and what it could be and what changes we need to make. Thank you for listening.